Alright, so today we are testing the AMD RX 7600 in the latest Lords of the Fallen. Before you click off, I actually just want to show you one thing, not that. Before you go to the timestamps, I just want to show you, and this is something that many people have missed. If you use ultra settings on reflection and global illumination, that uses higher levels of ray tracing, right? And that is why at ultra the performance is terrible. A lot of people miss this. I actually also missed this initially, but I did update the pinned comment on my RTX 4070 video. But just keep in mind that reflection and global illumination uses higher levels of ray tracing when it's set to ultra, right? So that said, today we'll be testing the RX 7600 at 1080p and 1440p. I don't think we'll be doing 4K, maybe just to see how it does. But this GPU is paired with a 12400F CPU. That again is paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 MHz CL18 memory, and currently we're at 1080p on the ultra preset, and I pressed the wrong button there. There we go. So we're on the ultra preset. I just disabled all these post-processing effects because they just look terrible, and off we go. Let's just reset our numbers here quickly. This is kind of a mission because I'm playing on controller and I reset all the numbers using the keyboard. I learned my lesson. This is definitely not a game that you want to try and play with a keyboard and mouse. Now, this is the latest version of the game. Today, I keep on pressing the wrong buttons. So today is a Monday, the 16th of October. So the latest version at the time of this recording. And unfortunately, they removed DLSS frame generation from... I keep on pressing the wrong buttons again. I removed the DLSS frame generation from this version. You can still manually enable it. Not that it's going to matter much because we are obviously not using frame generation or DLSS frame generation with a Radeon GPU. And this is not going well at all. So I keep on pressing X for attack, but X is actually heal. And so that's not ideal. But you can see at 1080p on the ultra preset, we are definitely not getting a very good experience here. We're getting 40 frames per second at most, right? And that's not what you want. And as I said, that's because ray tracing gets enabled. So I'm still not entirely sure exactly what kind of lumen this game uses at which settings. It's just that it says that high levels of ray tracing when you use the ultra and high presets, right? So this is not going well for us at all. I'm just going to reset the checkpoint because I need some healing, and then we'll drop it down to high. Right, so we're now on the high preset. I'm just using the mouse to change the settings. It's just a little bit easier. We are still at 1080p. Those are all our settings here. Let's just reset our numbers quickly. All right, so 1080p high, it seems like we're getting close to 60 frames per second, just still not a lot 60. Just have a look at the frame time graph there. It's quite inconsistent, and that translates to quite a few micro stutters. Sometimes even mini stutters, you actually do feel it. Even on a variable refresh rate monitor like I'm playing on at the moment, it is definitely noticeable, which is kind of annoying because they were supposed to fix that with the latest or the last two updates. I believe there were two updates since I last did the video last week Friday. And I died for some reason. I mean, not for some reason, but because I suck. Let's see if we can finish these guys up. I mean, you don't really die the first time you go into this umbral state, and you can then recover your lost health. And then if you exit umbral here, you are actually back in the world of the living, and you can just play as normally. Alright, so getting almost 60 frames per second here. You definitely need FSR because, as I said, we do have ray tracing enabled at these settings. There's no specific toggle for ray tracing, so unfortunately you can't just disable it at will. But this game does support DLSS and FSR, so we can use FSR to get a more playable experience. But we're just going to reset our checkpoint again, and then we'll play around with FSR a little bit. Right, so we just reset our checkpoint. We're still on the high preset. I don't think that the ultra preset is worth it, considering the massive performance penalty you get by enabling it. So we'll just enable FSR here. I think FSR on quality at 1080p should give us above 60 frames per second at all times. It might not look the best, but it does improve the frame rate quite a bit. Just make sure of one other thing, resolution scale. When none of these are used, the resolution scale is actually set to something extremely low. When I started it up with this GPU. It was actually set to 25% by default. With the RTX 4070 it was set to 50% by default. So if you don't see any performance gains when enabling FSR, just make sure that your resolution scale is set to 100%, because it might be that it's at 25%, and obviously FSR quality is much higher resolution than 25% resolution scale. Right, so let's see if we apply the changes here, and let's reset our numbers. And I mean, we went from 50 frames per second to around 80 frames per second. The frame time graph is still not as smooth as I'd like it to be. You can just see those mini stutters there, and it does translate to gameplay. It is felt a lot more when playing with a keyboard and mouse. It's not as noticeable with a controller. So this game is definitely playable as is. It's just annoying. Now, I'm not the best Souls player out there at all, so I'm just taking my time here. One thing that they did seem to improve a bit is the stuttering during combat, because it actually had quite a few frame time spikes during combat previously, and that seems to be better, but it's definitely still not perfect. Alright, so if you want some ray tracing effects, some decent looking visuals, etc., you can definitely play on the high preset, just enable some FSR and you'll be good to go. As I said, it might not look the best because it's not native resolution, but it gets the job done if you are looking for an above 60 frames per second experience, yeah. And I'm trying my best not to die, Alright, so we managed that. I'm just going to drop down to the medium preset for those of you who have high refresh rate monitors, and I do believe we might be able to get 100 plus FPS at 1080p on the medium preset with some FSR. Let's see what happens. So first off, we'll just disable FSR and we'll just apply that and drop this down to the medium preset and make sure everything is still fine. And let's reset our numbers once again, and now we're getting 80 frames per second native resolution, right? Whereas previously on the high preset we had to use FSR Quality to get 80 frames per second. So I do believe if we do enable FSR Quality even, we should be above 100 frames per second from what I've seen so far. Now that said, this game is perfectly playable at 60 frames per second. If the stuttering does not get in the way, sometimes your dodges and your parries need to be timed pretty accurately for them to actually be very effective, and stuttering can definitely hamper that experience. But 60 frames per second when it comes to input latency, especially with the controller, is definitely, I'd say, serviceable, right? And there's a chest there for those of you who haven't discovered it yet. Right, so before we kill all these guys, because we're just that good, let's just enable FSR here at 1080p on the medium preset and see what happens. Just remember, the game doesn't pause when you go into the options menu here, so we have to be quick. Let's go with FSR Quality and apply those changes and get out of the way here. All right, and let's reset our numbers and getting, well, just above 110 frames per second here. So this is definitely good for those of you who have high refresh rate monitors. Keep on pressing the wrong buttons. The animations take forever. Like, why is X not attack? And for some reason, I don't think you can change that. I mean, at least not in game. Maybe you can use a third-party tool and you can change it. But at the moment, unfortunately for me, for those of you who are Souls experts, you might be used to a right button being attack, but I'm definitely not. All right, so that's it for 1080p. Let's move on to 1440p and see how it goes. Right, we're now at 1440p and on the Ultra preset here, let's just disable FSR. Not that this is going to be a good experience at all, but just to give you an idea what the performance is like, you should really not be playing like this on this specific GPU. And let's reset our numbers here, and we are getting a very cinematic 24 frames per second here. Apologies if there's some background noise. The weather is quite heavy and there's a lot of thunder. We are going into our rainy season at the moment, so let's just get a lot of thunderstorms around about this time. And even if you don't hear the thunderstorms, the noise cancellation on the mic might just make my voice clip a little bit, but that's the reason for it. Alright, so 25 frames per second at 1440p Ultra, and not the experience you should be aiming for. Alright, that's enough of that. Let's just test it on high. Right, we're now on the high preset and we reset our numbers, and now we're getting pretty much what we had at 1080p on the Ultra preset. Definitely not great, but if you're aiming for a 30 frames per second experience, you can definitely play like this. I mean, it's not my preference, but I do know some people that don't mind playing at 30 frames per second, especially if the visuals look pretty good. And I mean at 1440p native. This game is definitely pretty good looking, but it's just a little bit too much for this little 7600. Right, so as we did earlier, let's just enable FSR here on the high preset. I'm not going to test the ultra preset as I just think it's a little bit of a waste. You'll have to use a pretty aggressive upscaling to get playable frame rates, or what I'd call playable frame rates, 60 frames per second or above. So let's leave it on the high preset and enable FSR. Right, so I'm just going to enable FSR Quality. We might see 60 frames per second. If not, we can just go to Balanced, and 60 frames per second it is. It'll definitely not be 60 frames per second maintained at all times, but if you are aiming for 60 frames per second and you can get close enough, then I think this is pretty good. Frame time graph is still a bit of an issue, and especially if you move the camera quite quickly, you do notice it. Like it's definitely not a smooth experience. So maybe locking the frame rate to 50 frames per second would alleviate that. I do think it would actually. And these guys are actually quite tough because you have to rift to umbral to fight them, and or to disable some parasite that protects them. But as you can see, we are getting close to 60 frames per second. Jen, why is it not targeting this guy? Like, he's the closest. Anyway. Right, so we got an average of 58 frames per second here, which is not terrible. It can be a little bit better, so if you do want a locked 60 frames per second, we'll have to use maybe the medium preset or FSR Balanced. So let's do that right away after I've reset the checkpoint again. Alright, so we've reset the checkpoint. Let me just get rid of that, and let's just go to FSR Balanced the other way. There we go. And let's just reset our numbers here. And we didn't gain much going from FSR Quality to FSR Balanced, but we might stay above 60 frames per second here. I think it might dip once or twice here and there, but it should stay above 60 the majority of the time, right? Depending on the fights. Some areas are definitely more demanding or intensive than others. So, I mean, it'll highly depend on the area that you're in or what's happening on the screen. And for some reason I really can't target this guy. Like, I'm not making any excuses. This is 100% a skill issue. I'm not a big fan of Souls games. Actually, I am going to try this game. I just need to start from scratch and just do the whole tutorial area again, just to acquaint myself with the controls and whatever. But I am going to try and finish this game. Like, it'll be my first Souls clone that I finish. I'm not a big fan of extremely difficult games, as I mentioned before, but just because the game is difficult and I find it frustrating doesn't make it a bad game at all. Though I do think this game can be improved, especially performance. Right, so whilst we're here, let's just drop it down to the medium preset and see what kind of frame rates we get. Right, so we're just going to disable FSR. Sorry, let me just get rid of that. And if we just go to the medium preset, don't think we'll be hitting 60 frames per second, but it's worth a shot. And I mean, close enough, right? So this is once again the high preset. We're getting the same frame rate as on the high preset with the FSR Quality, maybe slightly lower, but the game definitely looks a lot better at native, in my personal opinion. I mean, it makes sense because with FSR we are rendering internally at a lower resolution, and then it's being upscaled to native, so you do lose some quality settings there, or you do lose some visual quality. But I mean, this is actually not a terrible experience. I'm gonna grab that. I wouldn't mind playing like this if I had an RX 7600 and a 1440p monitor. I do think that medium gives you a pretty decent-ish experience. I mean, if you remember, whoops, Bloodborne was locked to 30 frames per second on the PlayStation. I mean, this is definitely an upgrade over that, frame rate wise, I mean. Alright, so let's see if we can actually get a high refresh rate experience at 1440p. Well, 1440p, we're going to enable some upscaling, so it won't be true 1440p. Right, so we're now on FSR Quality, and we are getting around 80 frames per second, which is pretty decent. But if you do have a 144 hertz monitor, you're obviously not maxing that out. Not that you have to. As I said, this game is perfectly playable at 80 frames per second. So let's see what happens once we enable FSR Balanced here. Not high performance, balanced. Right, there we go. So you can actually see the frame rate increasing with the setting change even before you apply it. So quality gets us 80 frames per second, balance gets us 90 frames per second, performance gets us 100 frames per second, and well, high performance, never heard of that. It should be ultra performance, right? So I mean, ultra performance or high performance gets us 126 frames per second. So I think if we do go with the DLSS balanced, that's 90 frames per second, and this should give you a pretty decent experience in my opinion. Obviously it won't maintain 90 frames per second, but close enough, right? And I don't think there are any more easy enemies to kill. I mean, I'm only trying to kill the easy enemies so as not to look like a complete noob on YouTube. I mean, it's way too late for that at this point, but well, you see what I mean? All right, but with that enemy dispatched, let's just try 4K. Let's just see what happens. I'm not expecting anything good to happen at 4K, but let's try it anyway. I'm just going to see what settings we actually need to use to get 60 frames per second. Yeah. So I've actually leveled up 3 times since I started making this benchmark video, the specific video. So that'll definitely help me a little bit later on in the game. But let's just go to 4K. Right, so 4K medium is getting us 25 frames per second. That's not going to cut it. Just make sure. So on the medium preset here, not sure if you'll actually get a decent frame rate at 4K medium without having to use extremely aggressive FSR. But let's just keep an eye on the frame rate counter there. But if we go to FSR Performance, it looks like we might hit 60 frames per second, right? So I mean, it won't maintain it, but the game does look pretty good. And FSR Performance is actually 1080p, right? So in 1080p internal resolution, then upscale to 4K. And if you do have a 4K monitor and you are aiming for 60 frames per second, this is definitely a setting that I'd consider. I don't think we've dropped below 60 frames per second yet. We might have. I mean, I'm not concentrating too much on the benchmark numbers there because obviously I don't want to die, and over here it's dropping below 60, but not too much. I mean, as I said, if my aim is 60 frames per second, it drops to 58 frames per second. I'm definitely not going to be too angry about that. But then again, this GPU is definitely not a 4K GPU. Apologies about all the cuts. It's probably a little bit more than what you are used to or comfortable with. There's just a lot of lightning, so whilst I'm talking, it'll just come out of nowhere, and I have to cut that out. So sorry about all that, but I think that's going to be it for this video. So if you do have an RX 7600 and you want to play 4K 60, well, 4K upscaled, then this is definitely what you can use. Otherwise, I just say stick to 1080p on the high preset or 1440p medium preset. Play a little bit with some FSR to get you 60 plus frames per second, and you'd be good to go. All right, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.